If you've ever had to deal with a child who somehow managed to get a wad of gum matted into his or her hair, your first instinct might be to reach for the scissors. It's fast, direct, and it gets rid of the problem. But you also end up butchering the haircut. When it comes to audio work, it's possible to be handed a session that looks more or less like that wad of gum. But taking the corrective equivalent of a pair of scissors to the problem is the last thing you want to do. The song you're about to hear, The Old General, is the result of exactly that kind of predicament. It's a mix that forced me to throw out my playbook and to contrive an alternate approach, an unconventional path to achieving clarity and euphony under some rather, shall we say, unforgiving constraints. Let me explain. Brian tracks his stems live, simultaneously capturing both vocal and acoustic guitar in an acoustically untreated room using a pair of Shure SM57 microphones. There is no isolation booth, and hence there is no separation between the vocal signal and the guitar signal. So it isn't even a matter of managing bleed between the two microphones. It's all bleed. So Brian hands me two tracks. One has a bit more guitar than vocal, and one has a bit more vocal than guitar. But they're baked into one another, so to speak. Now, while this raw, minimalist tracking style is manageable in a sparse arrangement, it becomes somewhat of a minefield the moment I begin stacking arrangement parts into the project. You might say the competition for acoustic real estate ramps up like compound interest. And the conventional zoning ordinances, EQing and the like, become more or less useless when trying to extricate the two arrangement elements that are ensconced in the same frequency band in the same signal. It's the kind of thing that can make you want to shave your head bald and go squat in a cave somewhere. But I digress. So, compounding the challenge was the fact that Brian chose to use his Martin acoustic guitar for this song, which is an instrument that is renowned for its beautiful chiming brightness that sits squarely in the heart of the human vocal range. Now, under normal circumstances, Brian's voice wields an aggressive 4 kilohertz resonance spike, which I affectionately refer to as his katana, that cuts through the guitar effortlessly. But while tracking for this session, he was recovering, as you know, from having lost his voice for several weeks. And that crucial 4 kilohertz cutting edge was heavily blunted as a result. So I was left with a matted knot of frequency hair a brilliant, dominant acoustic guitar part competing relentlessly with a set of tender vocal cords, both baked permanently into the same audio signal. Ordinarily, my workflow for achieving our album's target outlaw country vinyl aesthetic relies on conditioning the top end of the signal with a slew velocity limiter like Airwindows GoldenSlew or PlatinumSlew, flowing into Airwindows Air 4, which I use as a final soundstage topography shaper. I don't want to bore you with technical details. More of those are coming after I play through the song. If you came here for the technical end of things, I might want to jump to that. I'll put a timestamp in the description. Should have said that earlier, but anywho, the chain that I just described, it emulates the physical mechanical limitations of vinyl cutting heads while affording me a degree of topographical control that I think mastering engineers back in the day could only dream of. But here, the standard tactic of slew limitation wasn't cutting it, or rather, it was cutting it too much. To use a painterly metaphor, it was like it was too broad of a brush, put it that way. Instead of detangling the knot like a comb, GoldenSlew was acting more like those scissors. That's it. Trimming the high end of both the guitar and the vocal uniformly, leaving the mix somewhat smeared and constricted. And despite the usual asymmetric measures that I take to optimize vocal intelligibility for those with age-related hearing issues, measures that I intend to unpack in the next two videos, sufficient intelligibility remained frustratingly out of reach. The breakthrough came when I dug into the Airwindows toolkit and swapped the usual velocity limiting measures for a tool called Sinew, where GoldenSlew was the scissors, Sinew turned out to be the comb. More on that after I play the song. To the men on the committee, you will immediately notice that this maneuver has resulted in a sonic texture that is markedly different from that of the other songs on the album. It is still definitively within the boundary of our target outlaw country vinyl aesthetic, but is noticeably dustier and grainier, expressing a more assertively vintage lo-fi character. You may, however, rest assured that it rises to my own standards of beauty and excellence, at least from where I sit as no spring chicken with one half-deaf ear. It achieves both vocal intelligibility, arrangement clarity, as well as overall mix euphony. As for what it's worth, sorry, I had to do a script for this, you guys. And to me, it's worth quite a lot. As a sanity check, I ran this master by my engineer friend Brent in South Africa, a fine gentleman and capable engineer, the link to whose channel you can find in the video description. And Brent gave it the all clear. For any engineers or producers watching, this maneuver is an arrow that you might want to consider adding to your quiver. It might work for you as an extraction tool if you ever find yourself in a similar predicament, trying to rescue a vocal from baked-in frequency competition. And it represents interesting territory to explore purely for aesthetic purposes besides. If you're interested in a technical exposition of what's happening under the hood with the mathematics of Sinew versus GoldenSlew, stick around. I will break down the DSP principles and meter analysis right after the music plays. So, with the first half of the script out of the way, I'll pause this and set the table and be back for playback through the song. Thank you for watching.
I know I can't, but I wish I could stand with you where you stood. It's really something how I can track your steps through the void in time and the dreams you dreamt. Not every man could do what you've done. A wide-eyed soldier looking for his gun. An army heavy on your heels. Brave young men by blood were sealed. A cannon sang a sad war song, and every man knew where he belonged. When the war halted, there stood the Federals, but they couldn't break the fight in the old general. Stories told where men were slain, carried back home where they were laid. The living swear they've seen men ride mounts into the war machine. Maybe they never found closure, or maybe they know it's not over. An army heavy on your heels. Brave young men by blood were sealed. The cannon sang a sad war song, and every man knew where he belonged. When the war halted, there stood the Federals, but they couldn't break the fight in the old general. No, they couldn't break the fight. The old general.
All right. Let's pop the hood and look at the actual data profile of what just happened. If you're used to modern visual analyzers, the standard fast Fourier transform spectral displays that show you a clean dancing line of frequencies from bass to treble, this might look somewhat alien. We're looking at this mix through Airwindows Hit Record Meter, a different kind of analysis tool developed by Airwindows creator Chris Johnson. It doesn't track simple volume or frequency distribution. Instead, it charts transient velocity, sample-to-sample acceleration, and phase cohesion. When I first tried using meter as a visual reference for making the usual calibrations to this mix, everything looked fine, but my ears told me they were not, which was why I closed meter and did not look at it again until my ears told me that the problem was solved. When I finally opened it again, I was, to put it mildly, rather taken aback. I will explain the reason for my surprise shortly. But first, let's take a closer look at how the problem was solved. Normally, when trying to condition the high end for a vintage analog sound, I reach for a tool like Airwindows GoldenSlew or PlatinumSlew, or Slew 4. These plugins are high-frequency velocity limiters. Mathematically, they look at how fast a voltage waveform is accelerating from one digital sample to the next. If a transient moves too fast, like the sharp metallic snap of a pick hitting a bright Martin guitar string, the slew clipper clamps down on that sample, enforcing a strict speed limit. Now, I just used limiter and clipper back to back in a contradictory fashion, but I'm going to get to that in a minute. Now, in optimal circumstances, this successfully emulates the physics of a tape head or a vinyl lathe. But in our gum in the hair scenario, with Brian's recovering voice and the acoustic guitar permanently baked into the same microphone signals, standard slew limiting / clipping proved inappropriate. It saw the massive pointy transients of the Martin guitar and the delicate consonants of Brian's vocal as the exact same target. By indiscriminately clamping down on them both, it flattened the high-frequency velocity profile of both elements, smearing them together. The guitar still masked the voice. It just did it with less high-end sparkle. And it was a lose-lose situation, which is why I turned to Sinew. As I understand it, the breakthrough here lies in the underlying mathematics of its transfer curve, which manages high-frequency energy in a fundamentally different way. To understand why it worked where the other tools failed, we first need to make an important technical distinction between a traditional limiter and a clipper. A traditional limiter is just an ultra-fast compressor with an infinity to 1 ratio. When a signal crosses the threshold, an envelope detector calculates how much to turn a master volume knob down over a few milliseconds, and then how fast to turn it back up. The physical shape of the individual waveforms stays intact. The plugin just shrinks their overall size uniformly. Chris, however, rarely uses traditional time constant-based limiters on the master bus. Instead, his tools achieve their control using instantaneous mathematical functions that operate sample by sample, with absolutely zero attack or release times. But within that instantaneous domain, he uses two completely different strategies: velocity clipping and amplitude waveshaping. Normally, for our outlaw country vinyl aesthetic, I rely on GoldenSlew or PlatinumSlew or Slew 4. These plugins are high-frequency velocity clippers. They don't care how loud a sound is. Instead, they look across a string of multiple samples to calculate the slope or acceleration of the waveform. If a transient moves too fast, like the sharp metallic snap of a pick hitting a bright Martin guitar string, the plugin steps in and instantly chops off that velocity peak, forcing a rigid speed limit on the slope. But in our live bleed scenario, this hard velocity clipping was too broad a brush, trimming the high end of both the guitar and the vocal uniformly. Sinew operates in a different mathematical domain. It doesn't look backward at previous samples to track velocity, and it doesn't chop anything off. Instead, it is an instantaneous amplitude wave shaper that passes every single sample through a nonlinear sine function. When the summed signal of the current project hits this equation, its loudest elements, which happen to be those explosive high-amplitude voltage spikes from the Martin guitar pick attack, are driven deep into the curved top of the sine function. The math smoothly bends and rounds off those sharp peaks, mimicking the physics of magnetic tape bias saturation. When this multi-frequency signal hits that math block, something interesting happens psychoacoustically. The sharp, bright friction of the guitar strings is converted into harmonic saturation, essentially transforming those harsh transients into an organic, self-compressing texture bed. Because that transient glare is smoothed out rather than chopped off, it stops trigger fatiguing the listener's ear. Suddenly, a portal opens up for the vocal. Its delicate consonants and vowels, which carry the emotional weight of the performance but don't possess the raw explosive amplitude of the guitar pick attack, slip right through the linear portion of Sinew's transfer curve entirely untouched. When you look at this capture of the hit record meter running the final signal, look at the middle horizontal pane labeled slew. Notice that the blue dots tracking our high frequency acceleration are locked to a dense, straight horizontal plane across the top of the window or near the top of the window. Ordinarily, you might assume that the mix had smashed into a digital brick wall. But look closely at the top edge of that ceiling. It isn't a solid digital line. It has a dynamic, furry texture to it. That texture is the visual signature of Sinew and Air 4 working in tandem. Instead of turning Air 4's built-in version of the Sinew algorithm completely off, I dialed the ratio to 0.21, running it in conjunction with the dark F setting at its default 0.52. By blending just a taste of Air 4's internal velocity shaping with our dedicated Sinew plugin upstream, I avoid a heavy double clamping bottleneck. Instead, Air 4 acts as a fine-grained dynamic cushion. It lets the very tips of the high-frequency voltage acceleration flex naturally, rather than getting flat-topped by a single algorithm. That texture is the visual signature of transient life and microdynamics returning to the mix without letting the harshness back in. With the limiter layout settled, I pushed Air 4's twin Kalman filters above their defaults, setting air to 0.54 and ground to 0.59 to handle soundstage topography. The reason I was so surprised when I opened up Meter again had to do with the fact that the ceiling we see here is so low. Normally with GoldenSlew or PlatinumSlew or Air 4, I'm able to push that ceiling so that it shaves the top of the slew band itself, only occasionally overshooting it to emerge as red overslew spikes along its floor. It took a while to reconcile myself to the fact that Sinew is a different animal, and that the only way to get Meter's slew band looking the same way it did before is to drive the top two knobs in Air 4 until I've got a LUFS reading of approximately -7, which is beyond entirely too loud. What does this mean for the human ear? For an older listener dealing with age-related hearing loss and auditory processing degradation, this specific data profile represents acoustic stability. By shaving off the pointy, invisible transient spikes of the guitar and replacing them with a dense, consolidated harmonic bed, we drop the crest factor, the distance between the peak voltage and the average continuous energy, significantly. The mix clocks in at a reasonable -12 LUFS, but it does so without a whole lot of aggressive master limiter pumping. There are no sudden stabbing high-frequency transients to trigger the listener's acoustic reflex or overwhelm a damaged auditory nerve. The voice stays front, center, and intelligible, anchored inside a rather dusty, vintage frame that feels historic, intimate, and, well, more or less uncompromised. It's an unconventional answer to a rather unforgiving problem. Thanks for geeking out with me on this one. In the next two videos, I'm going to look at some specific parallel routing architectures that also furthered the objective of ensuring vocal clarity on this song. Hope to see you there. May the winds of clarity blow ever in your favor. Over and out.